everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here from sunny Sheffield in the north of England. So I'm Helen Milner. I'm the Group Chief Executive of Good Things Foundation. We're a UK-based national charity that is experts in digital and social inclusion. I always hesitate when I say national because we also have a sister charity that we established in Australia 3 years ago. So we're working in the UK and in Australia. So we work with thousands of community organisations up and down the country, and working with them in partnership, we then reach out to local people to help them to develop the skills that they need to take part in a digital society. So that's both skills, and during COVID, it's also been around devices as well. So I'm your chair for today, and our panel, we have Professor Helen Helsper and we have Atif Choudhury, and I'm just going to go to both of you and ask you to introduce yourselves. So over to you, Helen.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Helen, for introducing me. It's great to be on this panel. I've been looking forward to it. So I'm a professor of digital inequalities at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm there in the Media and Communications department. And if anybody's interested in any of the work that we're going to be talking about that we do with a global team, really, research, but also engaging with policymakers, they can have a look at the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes websites. We'll put the link in the chat or something, and the Y Skills project. And both projects look cross generations at the kind of outcomes, the opportunities that the digitization of society brings, but also some of the disadvantages and who is likely to be left behind and what the drivers and the consequences of this are.
So over to you, Atif. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I just realized. Hello, Zoom. So my name is Atif Choudhury. I am one of the co-founding directors of an organization called DNA, Diversity and Ability. And essentially what we work to do is provide assistive technology training and support and mentoring for people that need it most. Historically, our work has always been supporting disabled students in higher education, which has grown to support over 20,000 people access higher education and meaningful choices, as I like to say, rather than just jobs. That work has grown and it's moved very much into the workplace to provide more accessibility and more inclusion for people who are reticent to engage in disability language or disability cultures, who come from sort of intersectional backgrounds that might not necessarily apply for the support they need in the workplace, but very much deserve it. So that all of that has an intersectional impact on folks who don't really feel that they can engage on technologies because it might showcase or it might highlight an impact around shame or a disability that they've so far masked. And largely for the big part of the UK, the biggest impact on disabilities are indeed hidden. Our focus over the last 5 years is to look at as a social enterprise, really, the profits that we're making from that is always speaking to us to say, look, ultimately, however hard these stories are, there are folks who can access technology and assistive technology, but the very people who need it the most are quite likely to be the people who can access it the least. And that takes the position really around poverty and social exclusion into working with people going through rough sleeping often, and what we need to do to ensure that there's more accessibility for people facing literacy and long-term learning isolation. Often it's around dyslexia and autism and socioeconomics. So our work really has been working with large anti-homeless NGOs. Samungos has been a big one for us, and Crisis, and smaller ones as well, to make sure that we can be rolling out digital inclusion, but at the same time working on the assumption that a lot of people just don't read. So throwing gadgets and devices is one thing, but it's really recognizing what do people do when those gadgets are there, and are they meaningful if people aren't reading the information on there, and are they meaningful if it's really hard to be able to be on the internet in the first place.
That's right.
So that's really the work, and it's gone into thousands of people really, but we're enjoying it, but we're learning a lot. Anyway, that's
Fantastic, fantastic. That's great. It's so good to have you both with us, Atif and Ellen. For those of you who are observant, we actually did have two other panelists who have both had to pull out. Rich Dinger from Citizens Online, who is unwell, and Suzanne Westlake from Ocado, who has had a family emergency. But I know we're going to have a really, really lively and interesting conversation this afternoon. So what we're going to do is have a conversation with the panel for about half an hour, and then go over to Q&A to all of you in the audience. So please do put your questions in the Q&A function on this Zoom functionality, and I'll be having a look and you can upvote them. So this webinar is all about digital equality. And so, Alan, as you're a professor of digital inequalities, I thought I'd come to you. So what is digital equality, and is it different to digital inclusion or digital literacy? Other words that we might bandy around?
Yeah, thank you. Well, obviously, since I'm a professor of digital inequalities, I'll give you the definition of inequalities, and then you can flip it around. But actually, it's the inequalities that we have to define rather than the equalities. I think our working definition in our project and from Digital Skills Tangible Outcomes projects and the projects that I work on is that the digital inequalities are really kind of the systematic differences in who benefits and who is kind of disadvantaged with the increased digitization of society. So the important word here is systematic, right? It's not individuals differing in how they can take it up, but systematic differences between, for example, different groups within society or different nations around the world or different regions. And so these systematic differences are then in the opportunities and the kind of ability that individuals within these groups have to translate ICT access and skills and use into kind of tangible beneficial outcomes in their everyday lives, but also to avoid some of the risks or the associated harms that might come from this use of technology, not just by themselves, but also by other people. And that is different from inclusion in that when we talk about inclusion, which is really focused on just on what an individual can do, so that the individual's abilities and the individual's access or uses of technology. So I think that is an important distinction to make, that when we talk about inequality, it's really about systematic disadvantage of some populations. And actually, what we often, the terminology that we use is socio-digital inequalities to kind of make that link between the kind of social context and the social grouping of people, social cultural groupings, socioeconomic groupings of people that might be disadvantaged with this digitization.
Absolutely, that's really, really helpful. Atif, so what do you find are the drivers for digital inequality?
I think Eleanor sort of really touched on it. It's poverty. It's going to be social. It's going to be socioeconomics, familiarity, safety, a sense of belonging. I think that is tantamount to a lot of exclusion that happens anywhere. But we are, as often said, we're in a digital by default world. And in that space, we're watching a lot of folks excluded in that space with a lot of things where there's an expectation that they're going to go online or that they read online. I often use universal credit as an example of this, that the expectation is to streamline your support, to streamline your welfare, go online. Upload your job searches, this is expediency to financial support. But it never really asks you, do you read when you go online? Can you read when you're online? It's not really asking whether or not your job searches are literate enough to not be suspended, to not be sanctioned, to not be. And so what we're watching is a system that can say, well, this is done to support you. Online courts, a brilliant system, a system designed to offer a better justice and expediency to the law. And yet, folks who don't read, who are impacted around learning isolation, neurodiversity, dyslexia, are the least likely able to access it. And so what we're going to see is a correlation between socioeconomic poverty, familiarity, migration, and the people who are excluded the most.
Absolutely, and that interestingly, that I find that in the work that I do, and I've been doing for a couple of decades now, is that strangely though, I'm going to say inclusion, digital inclusion seems to be something that is more acceptable to talk about sometimes than poverty. That actually, if you talk about poverty, it feels like this huge, centuries old issue, lack of opportunity that successive governments and charities and others have been trying to solve, and that actually it feels too big, right, to solve. But if you talk about digital inclusion or digital exclusion, it feels like, well, just, obviously, if we just get all the super fast broadband pipes into the ground, then everything's going to be fine. And then if we just get everyone the skills that they need, then everything's going to be fine. But of course, I guess it goes back, Alan, to what you're saying about socio-digital inequalities, is that actually that many of those drivers that mean that people don't have equal opportunities are the very things that are keeping them off the internet, or making them unable to be able to use the internet in an equal way. But they won't go away by having some basic digital skills and having super fast broadband going down their street.
Yeah, of course. And I think, and this is a key point, right? We do make the distinction that, to say, okay, there's access and there's skills and there's uses of technology, and that there might be inequalities in all these different areas. But, just giving people access, as you already indicated, or just teaching individuals, for example, skills, sending them on a course, doesn't really cut it to get full participation and engagement in digital societies, right? Because it's not just an individual in front of the screen. And that's kind of why I also made that reference to the distinction between inequalities and inclusion or exclusion, or even the kind of even more kind of traditional language of divides, is that often the perception is that if we do something about the individual, when we send them on a course, or we teach them to use a specific technology, or we give them access, that then the problems will be solved. But Atif also alluded to this already. We see actually kind of this correspondence between the kinds of resources that people and the groups that they belong to or have kind of a certain identification with have had historically. So this could be socioeconomic, right? These kinds of resources, the poverty that you had talked about, but it can also be things like discrimination. And that's one of the things that we see in our projects, is that it's often the resources in which you are disadvantaged historically as kind of a particular group, that these express themselves as outcomes of the use of technology or the digitization of society, even if you have equal levels of skills or access, right? So one of the examples might be that women with the same levels of skills and access to men, they use a platform in exactly the same way, but it might be a much more negative experience because they get silenced more, or when they have a contribution, it doesn't get heard as much. And so we cannot ignore that kind of these ingrained patterns in social and digital interactions that kind of amplify each other. And I think that process of amplification is important, because it's also not just the social, right? It's not just saying, oh, why are we even looking at the digital? Because there's certain ways in which we design technologies, or certain ways in which we behave online that kind of amplify some of these processes. But on the other hand, there's also some things that are digital that could really help us overcome some of these obstacles, right? And I think Atif is much better placed to talk about some of these things, about how some of these barriers can be overcome as well. That the technology, if implemented in the right way, if designed in the right way, if the right kind of environment is created, it can actually also help people who might not have had access to some of these resources, like education, or it can create safe spaces for people to talk and explore identities, or to be with people, from whom they get support. So I think, that's why in our project, we really focus on the outcomes of the use of technologies, or the benefits and, the disadvantages, rather than on just measuring success in terms of inclusion by if they have access, or if they've gone through some skills training or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we could probably talk about that for another hour. But what I want to now talk about is the COVID, of course. So COVID-19 happened, and that lockdown started. I mean, it's almost 6 months now. It feels difficult to believe it's been that long, actually. So, I mean, Atif, like, understanding the system issues, if you like, around digital inequalities. I mean, in where I'm coming from and the work that I do, the lockdown just made that a lot worse. What about you? So in your area of work, how did digital inequalities affect the people that you support because of COVID-19 and lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, profoundly so, which I'm sure, I mean, the intimacy of what we all have gone through as a nation and even globally, it's profound. I think there's been interesting developments. It's been a taught experience in many ways, but for the sector, so if I think about digital inclusion for disabled people that are supporting them at a certain level within higher education, that sector really lent on us to try and figure out, okay, we have so many autistic learners. How do we make sure that this support is delivered online, that is felt, is understood? When we think about pitch, tone, communication, it's not just what I say, but it's how I say it. It's the non-verbal cues that are sometimes lost when we are working so much online, and yet we're forced to do it. And the assumptives that we make that we are creating a meaningful talk session or delivery. That has been really important to navigate well so that it lands well, particularly for marginalized people, particularly for students in higher education. But in terms of, touching on the conversation we're really having about the social inequality of it, the hardest felt is still going to be, and it's the one I'm really keen that we drive through, is that COVID has come along and said, we can put people in homes, we can put people in hotels. We did it as a nation. The country put thousands of people into different hotels. The problem we have is that, and sadly it's a real, it's difficult to make light of it, but isolation kills, loneliness kills. These have an impact on people's lives. The digital inclusion agenda is really aware of that. It's working hard to deal with that. The problem we've got here is that if I think about, well, if I give a scenario, perhaps in 2019, a person at a cash machine in a blanket begging for money could make a person feel uncomfortable. It can make you want to give money. It could make you want to, but it conjures up a sense of emotions for you where you're interacting with somebody in a desperate situation. Now, we're in a situation, if that person's still there at a cash machine in a blanket and coughing, it has a ramification for everybody. It has a ramification for even the person that is least likely wanting to engage. It has a ramification with the person who says, oh God, they're coughing, I can't be here, I can't use that machine, or I can't do this. It's changed a lot of things. So the government's response to put people into hotels was really positive. It was positive because it could enable safety for all of us, but it also can start measuring the fact that people shouldn't be sleeping so cold or rough. What the real challenge then became is isolationism. When people are in hotels, I live in Brighton, and Brighton's a really good example where there's some brilliant support mechanisms, but they are human-centered support mechanisms. There are even areas in Brighton where rough sleepers may go to find out where the best food is, where the most accessible food is. You may find it in perhaps not very constructive or healthy relationships with other people who are going for rough sleeping, but you also may find it for very positive relationships. When you're in a hotel, you're dependent on going online. You have to go online in order to access what the support is. It may be the first time, and I've really felt in the beginning of COVID, it was without mutual aid, it would have been the first time in my time in Brighton where people could have starved. And so going online meant this is where your health support is, this is where your food drop-offs are, this is where the mutual aid is. But if you don't, as I said earlier, if you don't read, how good is that? And if you can't access assistive technology that doesn't tell you what the document or what the information says, if you don't have a screen reader on your phone, then it's a problem. What that then does is force people back onto the streets. It forces people to go back to finding the very human-centered support that they need. So I guess what I'm saying is that without an agenda to say, look, we are going to roll out devices, and these devices may save lives, but these devices need assistive technology. We need to work on the assumptive that people who are rough sleeping are most likely to have literacy impacts. But the future of illiteracy isn't about whether a person reads or writes. It's about whether a person can access a device. If I can press a button and it reads it to me, then I understand what it says. If I can press a button and I talk to it and it types what I say, then I'm in control of what I need to say online. this is really the challenge. But I think in an age of digital inclusion that we're fighting for, or even exclusion, as Eleanor said, we've got to make sure that these kind of devices are accessible, but indeed the assistive technology that makes them useful to people. Otherwise, they're just a set of technologies that make you feel intimidated and guilty because you feel like it's being wasted on you. I say this not lightly. I say this from lived experiences of our team itself and what we do. And so I guess, you know, in terms of COVID, it was as real as that. It still is. But what we're seeing some really good stuff, really positive stuff to lend on. COVID has come along and allowed us to look at things like online digital boxes where we can put them in places and people can cluster and go online. Hopefully not cluster too closely, but the idea is that the device can immediately go online. That's not happened before. These are devices, an organization called Jungler did some really good work on this. These are devices that before COVID in the UK were only really being seen in parts of rural India. And we were looking at what villages need to go online in order to get support and even to be able to trade, and then seeing what role modeling happened in India that now needs to happen in the UK. So it's a really powerful dynamic, but again, without the lived experiences, I'd argue the support won't be relevant. It won't really understand what it's up against.
Yeah, and like you say, that they're very real barriers that excluded people from very specific support. I mean, at Good Things Foundation, we've found similar things with the fact that so the work that we do is in partnership with thousands of community organisations who provide a physical place for people to go and get access to the internet, get support to learn how to use it, get support to use it in a way that's meaningful for their lives and their life outcomes. But of course, all of those doors were instantly closed. And for us, that the big surprise was how many people then said, help, you know, that they didn't have access to the devices that they needed, didn't have access to the internet, or they're experiencing data poverty, so they did have a second-hand device or a smartphone. I think Atif, like the homeless people that you're talking about, but they didn't have any data and they couldn't afford any data and they didn't have any money. So we work with Future.now on a program called Devices.now and provided 11,500 tablets with SIM cards in to disadvantaged people and low-income families around the UK. But it's interesting that my reflection is that, I mean, it is massive, right? Massive. We know that people who were suffering extreme loneliness, people who were choosing between data or food to spend their money on, that, you know, they're the people that we've been helping. But it still feels that it was important as an emergency response to an emergency. But now COVID, you know, I don't know if you were much more prescient than I, but I didn't really even think it was going to last for 6 months, let alone however many years we're now going to be in this situation. But that I think the scene though also changed, and talking around digital inclusion and like the individual, that some of the people that we've been supporting have been in their 90s and they've never used the internet before, but they've never seen the benefit of it. They've never seen that they needed it. You know, they could go to their lunch club and they could get contact with other human beings, that, you know, they lived near the shops, that they had people who could deliver things for them when they didn't feel well, that they did have a very fulfilling and functioning life. But as soon as all those doors closed and all of those shops closed, they had no idea how to do it and how to help. And I'm so proud of the community partners who have been helping people who've been never in their 90s, who've never used the internet before, with a new device, and they've been talking them through on the phone and then getting them onto Zoom or onto Skype and then helping them learn how to use the internet and using some of the online learning platforms like Learn.
Helen, just to jump in a little bit, I think this is a really important thing, right? I think in some ways what's happened with COVID is that we've gone back to the kind of I think everybody realizes now, if it wasn't already kind of understood before, everybody realizes about this now, that no matter what happens, you know, access to good functioning technology that is not, you know, of which you have some autonomy, right? That you don't depend on others to be able to use it, or is fundamental to survival in this world. And it will be, you know, hopefully COVID will be not here forever, or at least will be less dominating our lives forever. But even then, right, this was already that some of the people who, or all of us who worked in this field, I think knew. And I think it's good that we've gone back to that discussion, like access, really. Without access, there's nothing else, right? You can't do anything without any access. And so other people using the technology for you will also not do, because they don't completely understand your needs. And of course, there's situations in which, you know, other people obviously support you and help you. But I think that is just a fundamental principle. And I think it was a shock for many people, also for teachers and for other people who, you know, who were daily contact with people that they might know were vulnerable, but the confrontation with that they lost track of some people because of this lack of connection, connection to the digital world, or that they were logging in and that they for the first time were realizing that the way in which they envisioned maybe their students or their clients or the people that they work with were using technologies, or their ability to use technologies, all of a sudden they were confronted with the fact that these were kind of illusions, right? In a sense that, oh my God, I did not realize that the person I'm working with actually has to go and sit in the toilet, you know, door shut, blanket over the head, to be able to have these kinds of, you know, interactions with the digital space, because they cannot, because they don't have that space outside. And I think this has been a little bit of a wake-up call, I think, for the whole world of how this works, and also some of the misunderstandings that we have. I do think, in terms of your question of who suffered most, I wanted to follow up on something that you kind of both hinted at, because I think it's for the people who weren't aware, who were really the big barriers were these skills and this kind of getting access. I think this has been great because they have been able to launch themselves. But the kind of this idea of social isolation and what we see, Atif already mentioned intersectionality, which is really the accumulation of several forms of disadvantage that some people suffer, and that it's especially aspects that have to do with alienation from wider society or a lack of social support that are amplified now that everybody's online. Because what we saw in the beginning, also in work contexts, so slightly outside of the sphere we've been talking about before, is that in the beginning everybody was online and everybody just came and it was Zoom and it was kind of new and glossy. And what we're seeing is we're seeing people full drop out now from these spaces, not just like in terms of not logging in, but when they're in these spaces, they become kind of invisible, because there's some people who have a certain comfort in these spaces, who have a certain type of skill that is not technical, because often we talk about technical skills, so you know how to turn it on, you know how to mute or unmute yourself or something like that. But another type of skill of understanding how the digital world works and how, you know, how you can maybe promote your own thoughts and materials or contribute in a creative and constructive way, right? How you might have people listen to you, or how other people, how anonymity works, how certain types of platforms work to network people, like, and we are seeing that the people who don't have those kinds of skills and have an accumulation of these disadvantages, who don't have social support networks that they can go to, and then when they're in online, that's kind of replicated, right? They don't really fit in, and they don't have the kind of people who will notice that they're being left behind, or that they're invisible, or that they're not being heard, who will then prop them up and support them. I think this is something, if we talk about who has suffered most and who is most likely to, you know, also in the future suffer more in these digital environments, is these people who are kind of being pushed to the sides. And we're talking on this platform, right, Zoom. One of the ways in which these platforms have designed is that the person who's talking, who has the clear voice, gets prominence, right? You get shown, And so it's the people who have that kind of presence, who can you know, jump in on a conversation, or have the kind of voice that carries best. It's logical that these technologies are designed that way, because otherwise it'd be cacophony of voices and languages. But it does mean that people who maybe don't have that kind of you know, skill or a bit understanding of the technology, or just feel very uncomfortable doing that, they are the people who are likely to be left behind. So there's a combination between the design of the technologies and people's comfort and alienation in these kinds of technologies, because it is sometimes not really observable when somebody is being left behind, or, you know, not as observable as when somebody has a bad connection or things like that. So I think we need to think about some of these skills and some of these abilities or opportunities in a slightly different way than we have before. And that's something that was really brought to the foreground.
And I think it comes to something that you were talking about around what I think of as called blended that actually, you know, that like your Jangara system, like where people can come and be in a similar space and use it together. Just actually today, just before this panel session, a couple of our community partners came to a whole team meeting at Good Things Foundation and talked about their experiences of COVID and how our charity has been supporting them. And one of them said exactly what you're saying, Helen, actually, is that some people, so they managed to get them devices and they got them online and they were supporting them virtually, but and they were quite keen in the beginning, but then they slowly dropped away. And so what they've been doing, that one's actually also happens to be here in Sheffield, is that they've started, and a lot of them are asylum seekers and migrants, and they've started doing visits to outdoor places in Sheffield. So they're getting them together in, you know, 1 meter, 2 meters apart, little groups, and they're going to a park or they're going to a monument, just so that they can have some human contact. So because they saw that actually these people were keen and they learned how to do it, and then but they just didn't have either this, let's call them skills, but maybe the, you know, the personal attributes or the enjoyment factor to kind of keep online. And actually that the community partner were very, very worried about those people being isolated. And I think sometimes it's that blend, isn't it? And I think that's probably what
it might then transfer back, right? You've gone, you have an experience, then you go online and talk about it, or you share photos, or you create a space. So
yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Atif, do you want to come in about either what Ellen was talking about or this kind of blended?
I mean, COVID has come along, and as I said, it is not a great equaler or leveler as famously as said, because we're watching different folks being impacted stronger than others, depending on their genetics, their skin color, and pre-existing conditions. But we are, and it is the heart of what we're talking about, inequality, that people are going to have more likelihood of pre-existing conditions. A lack of access to healthcare is a pre-existing condition, right? You know, poverty is a pre-existing. So what I sort of found myself thinking, because over the last few years, you know, I've been doing a lot of work around supporting around refugee camps and communities there. And I think if we think about, I remember being in Italy and seeing folks coming across in boats and how harrowing it was to receive, you know, the visceral look of people trying to survive this. But one thing, and I've always said this, is the one thing that is in the hands of people that are holding on very dearly, other than their children, is what? You know, everyone can say the other thing that's in their hands, along with their children and precious belongings, is always that. It's this, right? It's that mobile phone. It's the link that says, look, I'm alive. I made it across. It's a link to another family somewhere going through this to say we survived it. I think that point is no longer a mobile phone. It's a survival device. It's a tool working to keep people alive. And I think we've got to get to a point where we divorce ourselves from terminologies around technology, but think about equity and what tools build equality and equity. Because otherwise, we're just going to either be the people who get excited by technology or the people who are scared of it. What we're not getting through to say is, actually, these are the devices that keep us going. COVID has come along and said, it is as real as that. If I take my mind outside of code for a second, giving out devices, and I think you guys have done such great work, particularly, you know, from what I can see of the devices campaign. We also did some stuff, you know, supporting really good work happening here. But the idea is that if I give out devices to people going through rough sleeping, it can look like it's an expensive task. It can look like there's going to be a measurement of loss. There's going to be look like it, etc., etc. And I hear it all day. I almost get bored of it. What I am interested in knowing is the cost of a device to give out versus the cost of health, sanitation, policing, mental health, physical violence when you're sleeping. These things cost us thousands. As a UK economy, it costs thousands of thousands just to keep someone alive. It's famously said that it's cheaper to go to Eton than it is to sleep in the streets of London. Yeah, and it is because, and it does make sense, it's the cost involved in maintaining a balance of people when they are living on the streets. As I said, health, hygiene, policing, medication, etc. But when we are giving out these devices and trying to say how we can measure them, I'm often faced an attitudinal change that says, well, how do you know they're not going to be used for drugs? Or how do you know? And I said, I don't. I truly don't. We could work on leverage we can work on how we monitor that, and we can work on how we may be able to have some traceability on it. But the argument is a bit lost on a lot of folks who not realize how important these survival devices are. It's like saying, look, you know, how do I know that someone who's not wearing shoes is not going to use the shoes for drugs or alcohol? Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but that doesn't mean they don't deserve to have shoes. We need to give out shoes to those who don't have shoes. And it's the same principle, that this is
and actually, you're absolutely right, because for devices.now, we were buying a £100 tablet with a £40 SIM card in it, right? That would give us 25 gigabits over a year, and that like £140, like that is so cheap. And a bit like you're saying about the shoes or whatever else, is that we still seem to have this idea that technology somehow is precious in itself, or the technical skills are precious in themselves. Let's go on to some questions from the audience. We've had some really good questions coming in, and please do keep putting questions into the Q&A. So there's a question here. They're all from anonymous attendee, unfortunately. So if any of you want to put your name in brackets at the end, then that might be a little less anonymous. But the one that's been upvoted to the top of the list is, given the biggest driver of digital exclusion is poverty. Ellen, I'll come to you first, just to give you some warning. Given the biggest driver of digital exclusion is poverty, what needs to be done to prepare for the economic impact of COVID, and how can we be proactive rather than reactive?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit contest that the most important driver is poverty, because actually we see that education and kind of engagement and inclusion in wider society is actually more important than, you know, because if it was just poverty and an inability to buy devices, then we wouldn't have as much of a problem, right? Then we could provide devices, but it's very important. But I think in terms of...
Sorry, Ellen, can I just interrupt? Is what you're saying, though, it's about the intersectionality of poverty?
Yeah, it's in a way, yes.
People in poverty have low educational attainment, they'll have other inequalities within their life. Yeah?
I'm saying this also a little bit in reaction to what you were saying in the beginning, because poverty is an immense thing to tackle, right? So I'm saying, like, it's important, but it's not the only thing. And in a way, in the digital space, if it's the most important driver of digital exclusion, poverty is the easiest thing to overcome. Because if poverty means that people cannot afford devices, then the solution is to give them devices. Yeah. So if it was just poverty, it costs money, but the solution in that sense would be relatively straightforward. And I think we need to recognize poverty is important, and all the great work that you've just talked about is fundamental, right? It's indispensable to do these kinds of things. But I think poverty manifests itself in many different ways. And we talk about, you know, it's often linked to health poverty or education poverty. And it's often those other types of poverties that are really problematic and that require more complex, multi-stakeholder kind of solutions. And I kind of, at this point, also want to, that's why I like these questions. And I saw another question in the corner of my eye about AI in the future. So maybe I'll try to tie those a little bit together. Because a lot of the things that we've been talking about here is about what we can do for the people who are excluded, or what do the people who are excluded need to do or need to know to be included in society, right? We've emphasized a lot on the people who are like disadvantaged, as if the only thing we can do is ask them, what do you need? And like, what do you need to learn? And what do you need to get to be able to get included? But we forget that we are the ones who are constructing technology, technological spaces, designing things in a certain way, that every action that we take online, every way in which we engage with technology, assuming that we are not necessarily the most disadvantaged people that we are talking about in this discussion, is that all of our actions in digital spaces have consequences for everybody else who comes afterwards, right? If we use certain platforms, if we click on certain links, if we write certain types of information, if we design technologies in certain types of ways, that means that the person who comes after us is going to come in a space that is ours, right? And I'm not talking about high-level programming. I'm not talking necessarily about knowing how to design an app, right? But even the fact that we are downloading a certain app or looking at certain content and not others, and the fact that we are having algorithms learn that the person with this kind of voice or with that kind of expression or that kind of picture is likely to be the most popular and the most liked, right? All of our actions have consequences. So I think in terms of like thinking about beyond that kind of poverty access level, to create inclusive spaces, inclusive digital societies and digital spaces, we need to start looking at what we are doing that makes other people less able to participate. Right? So what is it that, how are we shaping this world that we are in? It's a little bit more complicated because all of a sudden it requires turning like, you know, the looking glass around and looking at ourselves and looking at what am I doing when I'm in this kind of environment that might mean that I'm not making a space that's not as welcoming or not as easy to navigate for the person who is there with me or the person that comes after me, right? So I need to think, and this is in our actions, those of us who work, for those of us who have relationships with other people, for those of us who engage with businesses and policymakers and all of that. I think we constantly need to ask the questions, is the way in which we are designing technologies, designing policies, designing digital communication environments at work or in a school or at home, is this in some way kind of perpetuating the problem, right? Are we excluding people? Are we including people? Because we're all of us responsible. It's a collective responsibility. And this is, you know, I've been coming back to this because from the beginning, I have a little bit of a problem with the word inclusion because it has that same connotation, right? It's what does this individual need to do to be dragged into this world that we have populated and designed in a certain way, instead of thinking like, okay, what would it look like and what kind of public policies need to be in place? That cannot just be economic policies. It cannot just be, you know, tax relief on buying tech or cheap digital courses, right? Because then they will still be designed according to what, you know, our world looks like and what we feel comfortable with. So I think that's a really more philosophical perhaps, but if we talk about what can we do is in our everyday actions and our everyday engagement, whether it's professional or personal, we can think about, is what I'm doing shaping that digital future in some way? Yeah.
Atif, you look very eager to come in.
Yeah, well, I very much share a lot of that. I guess it's when I think about poverty. I mean, I just want to check you can all hear me as well. Is that, you can all hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
You're in here. Right. So I mean, look, I think really it's about agency to an extent, right? It's about choice. It's about meaningful choice of engagement. Are people given choice? And I strongly think where I guess I'm going to put poverty back on the table slightly is that there are those who can exercise agency better than others, depending on the class dynamics that they're in terms of their access. Fundamentally, it's about attitudes, right? The most disabling thing on earth is attitudes. It could be the attitude we have about ourselves that stops us engaging on something or trying something or joining a cause or not. And it's usually the attitudes we have about people we've never even met before. And all of that has a bearing. After that, it's socioeconomics. It's the socioeconomics that says, here is an organization that's giving out free tech. Here is an organization that's doing training. Here is people that can support you. You have to be in a bubble to an extent, forgive that terminology in today's land. But you need to be in a sort of bit of a bubble to know that even exists or that there are grants. There's a socioeconomic discussion that exercises that agency. I'll illustrate a point, and I think Helen has really touched on it, that sometimes we're doing this a lot. I worked on a program around journey to employment, and it was about trying to support people to be online. My team did it a lot. I should say my team's made out of over 100 people with disabled experiences who are teaching technology every day, impacted around physical and neurodivergent strengths and differences. But we won a big award for the disability employment gap and such. And I find myself thinking, I'm not trying to win an award for the disability employment gap. I am exposing it, but I'm not trying to win an award for it. I'm trying to show that without lived experiences, we can't be this good. We can't do it. Without lived experiences, how can we ever be real? And then it applies itself that we've created equity. We've created enough equity for those lived experiences to have jobs and access. And if I think about the journey to employment work, what I saw over 6 months was a consistency of people doing courses in order to keep their welfare, in order to fulfill the demands they were doing. And I was a little bit taken aback as to how many people had done Microsoft Office courses and were still on this course. And what shocked me was sometimes it was 6 or 7 people. So I'm thinking, okay, so it's not the finances to get a gadget or a device, and it's not the finances to get the software. But what I did notice, and what was really clear, and I think it's important, is how few people could actually see the screen. How few people weren't aware that Zoom technology even existed, or that how few people knew there was a screen reader, or how few people would actually read, or et cetera, et cetera. And it went on and on. And so I found myself watching and saying, okay, you're essentially doing the course, not necessarily for a job search, although that's the aspirations, but by 7 times, you're doing the course essentially just so you can keep your welfare. You're doing the course because you need to put something into your universal credit application to say you have done a course. Now, doing a course to endure a course on technology is one thing to keep your welfare. Doing a course to say, I actually want to build these skills, but after 7 times, it's really fair for a person to say, I'm really cynical about this, but this is the cycle in which I'm in. And that's what made me feel like, yeah, until we change that, when that means changing the attitudes, not of people participating, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with people participating. It's actually saying people should be, a system that says people will be ashamed if they're not doing well enough on digital equality, or they're not seen to be participating enough on digital inclusion. When the whole thing, if you can't see, crikey, having 7 days of a course when you can't see the screen, and you yourself aren't aware you can do anything about it, must be intimidating as hell. And yet people are doing it.
Absolutely. And I think that I'm going to try and put a bit more optimism in here, I think, because that we know that, from the work that we do with community organisations, and that's the real power of the model with Good Things Foundation, is because they are in the community and they're working with people like them with similar lived experiences, supporting people to have choices and agency. But going back to the question about how can we be proactive rather than reactive, that actually making sure that everybody, like everybody has got the access that they can afford, and that may well mean that it needs to be free for many people, and that they do have the devices that they can use. If they can't see it, they have a device that they can see, and that actually and that people have the skills to be able to use it. Is that it absolutely does not ignore the fact that there are many other things at play here when we're thinking about inequalities, but it does bring some equality into the equation. That they are things that we can do. These are things that the government could easily invest in. Government is spending $6.5 billion on broadband infrastructure, can invest a small percentage of that, or an equivalent of a small percentage of that, in making sure that people do have access and skills, and actually tackling data poverty and recognizing that data poverty is a real thing, that there are people in this country who can't afford it, that there are not services available to them, that I had an email from someone yesterday who has lost their job because of COVID, but because of the way that the forms worked and everything, hasn't got universal credit yet. And I think this probably comes back to your point, Ellen, that they don't have any money because COVID, and they lost their jobs, but they're educated and they can read and they're not disabled.
And they contacted you, they knew where to go.
Yeah, they contacted me. Well, they contacted me because they got a device from the program. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But like a really, a long, articulate email to talk about all of the problems that they'd encountered with universal credit, and because they're not on benefits yet, they couldn't get the BT Basics. Like, they even knew about BT Basics, and we know how hard that is to find on the internet, right? So that actually that there are things that we can do to tackle this.
And I think, the question was about proactive, right? And I think, all the things that you talked about in terms of being proactive is extremely important. Like, there's a baseline that needs to be taken care of, because otherwise we'll always be reactive and just reacting to the emergency. You talked about it earlier, right? Like, there's an emergency, we have to hand out this thing, because otherwise really people will be left behind. And I think in terms of proactivity, it's a kind of a way of thinking, or a language maybe, that we need to start using whenever we start something, or whenever we are deciding on something. You talked about policy making, right? I think in a way, in the same way that we have, kind of an equity audit, right? If something gets decided, somebody new gets hired, or a new process gets installed, or an annual review, we look at things like equality, some better than others, but we look at, okay, will this have a consequence on certain groups that, have protected characteristics or might have been disadvantaged in the past? And I think we have to do that with the digital as well, right? What are the consequences of doing something or designing a technology or doing something in our company, or, like if you want to use it at a personal level, in our neighborhood, in our organization, in a certain way and not in another way, right? What are the consequences? Can we work through maybe what the unintended consequences are? Because often we are reactive because we haven't really thought through the future scenarios of what this might mean for different kinds of people that are engaging in that digital space or the digital societies that we live in. And I think this is something that has to, the UK in certain ways can be commended for this, because they have a long history of, in this space of digital inequalities, of multi-stakeholder approaches, right? They have organizations coming together and say, okay, what are the things that we share, that we've seen, that maybe somebody else should know about before they start engaging on a certain path, right? Maybe they can be the job done at getting that out there and communicating that. But that's, the Digital Inclusion Working Group, the research group around this, I think, been doing work like this for quite a long time. And I think that multi-stakeholder approach, not reinventing the wheel every time, but really creating that kind of collective knowledge, makes us also able to kind of predict that some of the things might work or might not work in the future. And I think that's really important, that multi-stakeholder engagement. I think we can still do a little bit more to involve businesses who are really designing this infrastructure, these lived experiences in our everyday life, and getting them more involved, because they seem to be working a little bit more in silos and trying to deal with their own problems. But I think that is fundamental, right? To have a kind of a more future vision in terms of saying, like, okay, what are the consequences of the decision that we take now? Just like I was talking about before, our personal proactive responsibility to think like, okay, if I put this kind of content on, if I send that email, if I, it's a collective responsibility, but it allows us to kind of, be a bit more aware of what the consequences of our actions are. And yet these actions are digital in many ways, so it will have digital consequences.
Okay. Just keen to get onto some more questions. I mean, this one I think is similar. That there's a question around safety. So I believe that safety is one of the reasons driving people away from technology. This is particularly true of survivors who are at risk of technology facilitated abuse. So whilst we're working on addressing digital poverty and the issues of digital literacy, how do we make digital spaces inclusive and safe for everyone? And whose shoulders does this responsibility lie upon? Atif, is this something that you've come across around online safety?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant shift in space, for sure. I mean, look, when thinking about people that have pronounced impacts around neurodiversity, what information they share, who they share it with, what could be perceived as how should I say, relationship cues, about what is oversharing, what's undersharing. When that's done online as well, that could have a huge impact. So right down to looking at okay, I got a team that's supporting disabled people every day, and having to get people to safely create passwords that they can remember, knowing full well that memory loss is part of the concern that somebody's going through day to day, be it medication, be it the impact of the disability. So, and sometimes we'd have folks that would want to tell us that their password in order to reinforce it. And that's the worst thing that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're constantly trying to work on making sure it's safe. In terms of the abuse, I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of strengthening charters, particularly for young people as well. I don't have a position on that other than to watch it and say, look, that it needs a collective effort.
Yeah.
There are a lot of positive things. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ellen, I mean, obviously the work you did with EU Kids.
Yeah, actually the project, the kind of, the reiterated version, because we had Global Kids Online where we do project around the world, but the Y Skills, which is youth skills project, is that we're right now running in Europe, tackles a lot of these issues, and it actually is related to youth well-being. So it's not so much digital skills and preparing people for the workplace or the labor of the future, but it's really about skills for well-being and how these relate and what are the skills that young people need, and what are they lacking? Because there's still a little bit of this myth as well of the digital kind of native, right? That all young people, we see them push buttons and it seems, oh, they're so comfortable, you know, like they don't need any questions. And we see some shame in that as well. Like young people sometimes feel that they can't, you know, go to adults or trusted adults or others to ask these kinds of questions because they feel it's a kind of a separate world and they wouldn't know, and or they think I know. So I think that kind of just a dialogue about that. I think, you know, people's experiences and how learning from other people's experiences, again, it's not just, you know, like vulnerability or harassment or kind of these kinds of things, you know, if there's an abuse, there's always an abuser, right? As well as the abused. So I think it's also, and sometimes we assume that there's this villain person out there that's trolling or that's, you know, and actually a lot of the more microaggressions that we see that lead, or these abuses that then escalate and lead to bigger abuse, it's also because people, you know, I'm not saying that there's no excesses and that there's no real dangerous cases that are illegal and that need to be monitored. But a lot of it is really not understanding the impact of these kind of everyday, or how we as a social group might inadvertently gang up on somebody, or something that we said on a person with a particular condition in a particular circumstances can have a really profound effect. And these kinds of things we really need to, that's a dialogue. And I agree with Atif there. I think there's much more that can be done. And so this is some of the things that we're looking at with the Wise Skills Project, because we're looking at specifically at vulnerable groups of young people who might also have histories of abuse and, you know, susceptibility, or don't have a stable environment that they can fall back on. I think the other work that I'll plug, which is not necessarily mine at the moment, but I've been involved in, is the work that's done by my colleague, Sonia Livingston, who's looking at child rights in the digital age. And a lot of the work they do is very, very interesting, because it's also, you mentioned a choice and kind of agency, right? And young people in particular, we often forget that they also have a voice and agency, and that we need to understand also the world from their perspective, because we sometimes have, you know, I've heard parents say, I've heard adults say, well, you know, if you get bullied online, let's go off social media, just turn it off. Why would you do this? And you're like, but that's your life, you know, that's where you are an independent person. That's also where you have positive relationships, where you build love and friendship and things like that. So really understanding, if you talk to young people, there's a lot of nuance to, you know, it's like crossing the street. You can cross the street to get that ice cream, to use one of these examples on a hot day that we might all want to be doing. Yeah, there's a risk there, right? You can, you know, somebody can shout things at you. You could be hit by a car. There's all kinds of things. And to navigate that space, I think requires a little bit more of a nuanced discussion than we're not having. It's not, you know, that requires more of a dialogue, I think, between generations, but also with kind of within people who have these same experiences that we're talking about, and being honest about this as well, that sometimes we do make mistakes, and how are we going to prevent these things from happening in the future? And obviously with gross, you know, abuses of racism, sexism, those kinds of things, there are laws in place, and we need to make sure that this cannot, you know, that doesn't go too far. So when we talk about safe spaces, I'll finish with one of the things that I was I've been addressing a little bit in the book that I've just been writing, that will be published soon, which is that one of the things in the safe spaces that we see is really interesting, is that we see that people who come from groups that have suffered abuse or have had these kind of abusive experiences, they have a great need for these safe spaces. You know, they don't want to be in environments where they feel attacked all the time. So we see them kind of create these, what we might call filter bubbles, yeah, or echo chambers in kind of digital language. So they create these safe spaces where they feel very comfortable. They feel the digital space is comfortable because they've created these spaces for themselves. Now, the consequence of that is that they are leaving the more public spaces where this abuse is going on because they haven't felt comfortable. So what we see is in public spaces, there's often less of these voices, and these experiences are less shared, and people have kind of less diversity in a way of these lived experiences that we were talking about. And while the people who've gone off into these safe spaces do know, obviously, about the other outside world, which might be a bit more violent, and where if they go in there, they have to defend themselves or stand up, right? The people who are in these public spaces are much less likely to be exposed to the experiences of the people who are finding these safe spaces. So again, I think this is a, you know, an unintended consequence, where we see that echo chambers and filter bubbles for people who come from a disadvantaged position have a positive effect that broadens their experience, while echo chambers and filter bubbles for people who have a dominant position, who have kind of a, kind of privileged view of reality, actually have the opposite effect. They create kind of isolated spaces with less exposure to other people's experiences, and therefore less solidarity and less also perceived need to do something about a lack of diversity. And I'm talking diversity in a very big way, like a broad way, right? Diversity, neurodiversity, Atif talked about it, but also kind of experiences that come from growing up in different places and in different home environments.
Yeah. Atif, earlier you mentioned India. One of our delegates is from South Africa, and they've asked the question, how can we in developing countries, e.g. South Africa, encourage our policymakers to stop adopting digital inclusion solutions and approaches meant for developed contexts and consider our own context when developing digital inclusion policies? So I don't know, is that something that you've come across other countries?
Yeah, in fact, we're working on this. I'll put a link to this sort of work on our website as well. We're working right now on it around looking at the UN CRPD Accords. These are the UN Accords centered around people with disabilities. And yeah, it can't be said enough. And it's tokenized far too often. But it is about lived experiences. It's about looking at the setting of where somebody is, rather than I struggle around development and development language, and so I'm not going to even use it. So but I will say is this, that you often hear it, think, act local, work global. The idea is that you have a space to say what is relevant. If it's not intersectional, then I would ask you, everyone, is it relevant? Is it relevant? So if you're looking at an experience in South Africa, you're asking, okay, what are the social economic settings that make this exclusion consistent? And what are the attitudinal settings that make this consistency? Our focus is to look at what is the impact. If you think about disability, the idea isn't to talk about what are the disabilities, because it can mean somebody with cerebral palsy can have a very different experience to somebody else, depending on their familiarity with technology, the impact of the cerebral palsy, and the social setting in which they're in, and the support mechanisms around them. And we can spend a long time talking about their disability, not understanding, well, who's the individual in the room? What's the aspirations of the room? I would say that in any context. So it's trying to say, okay, how do we base an assessment of need? If I use the South Africa model, who are the people we're assessing for? What are their aspirations, first and foremost? And what's the impact of the disability or the exclusion? In the case of South Africa, I think there's some really good role modeling around open source technologies. They're being pioneered by South Africans. Why not use it as well? It doesn't need to always be something that's led by the global north, as it were.
Yeah.
Ellen, I can't say that.
That's great. And Ellen, have you got anything else to add, or any other? There's another question about, are there any other good international examples that
yeah, so I think I've done a lot of work in Latin America and in also kind of some projects in Asia, the Middle East, and things like that. And I think this point that Atif is making is really, really important. When we have like our 7-step plan for policymakers, for example, we always say, like, you start with what is the situation in your country, what are the kinds of issues that prevent, and I agree, development language is a bit uncomfortable, but, prevent further development and further, equality or equity of opportunity in this country for different groups. And these are often specific, right? So these are kind of, there's some universalities, but the circumstances under which these come up are historically and politically specific, socially specific, culturally specific. So you start with that, and then you look at, okay, what is the contribution of the digital to this? Right, because some of these things are not going to be solved by the digital, right? Like there's going to be a part of it, but we say, like, okay, is it lack of certain types of skills that's specific in our country, or is it are there certain types of histories of experience with science or technology that shape our attitudes towards this being acceptable? Like one of the big examples, going back to the safety aspect of it, like people's historic experiences in different countries with privacy and surveillance, state surveillance, and use of data and public data, it's very different. And you can see that therefore also attitudes and trust in governments and institutions to use this kind of data well for very good reasons differs a lot. So, obviously you can't, if it is a bad situation where governments are going to be abusing citizen data, then, you know, asking people to contribute and share data is not going to be very useful. So it's very important, if you think about the local, to really engage with local organization. And Helen, you do work like that as well. I know, like, you engage with the local issues, and then you see what is the digital contributing, where will the intervention be most effective? Do we need to do something about political policing, you know, big things nowadays, policing structures, you know, stuff like that. And to what extent can technologies help to do that? And I think it's really interesting, and I forgot to follow up on that, but it's this idea of choice, right? In our broader definition of digital inequalities and digital literacy, we define it really as the ability to decide when to use and when not to use technologies to obtain beneficial outcomes in digital societies. And we often forget this about not to use. And one of the things that we are seeing happening now is that actually some of the bigger inequalities now is who can decide to step back. Who can decide, oh, I'm not going to give my data now, or actually that thing I'm not going to do because, you know what, I can get a better outcome if I take a different route, right? And we see that especially people in more disadvantaged situations or countries where, you know, this kind of technology is pushed from the top, where they don't have a choice, because otherwise they won't get, you know, the benefits example, or they won't be able to find, you know, good food or manage their land because they need that kind of, and they don't have any choice, right? They give it. And these are often also the people who have been monitored and surveilled for a very long time. So I think this idea of choice, of creating a system in which there's also the equality of not just understanding when it's good to contribute with data and with participation in space, but also understanding or an understanding an equality of opportunity to be able to step out when it's actually not that good for you, is a really important discussion that we need to have in the future, especially when we think about AI and all these techs that's just constantly gathering information about us. You know, like Internet of Things are coming and all these kinds of things. So this kind of awareness, I think, is going to be more and more important. And that needs to be local, because every local situation and how governments and organizations and companies work with our data are going to be very specific to different populations and countries.
Yeah, and just bringing it back to the sort of UK context, the point about whether you have a choice to use it or not. I mean, I think that's become very live in the UK during COVID-19, of course, is because more and more government services have gone online, and some of those alternative channels have been closed because of lockdown. And so, you know, just this week, there's been the controversy about whether consultations, which of course I'm sure most GPs do have, but that you know, university claim benefits, you have to do it online. You have to provide your data into that online.
In some countries, you know, that you know, they have also different systems, but it's going to be a thing here as well. You know, student monitoring, scoring, and things like that. So for young people, like if you're in a public system where schools are constantly evaluated, and you know, it's really important where you end up, you also are not going to have a choice, and that data is going to stay there. We know that it is very little still kind of agreement and protection around what's going to happen with that data. Might follow you around for the rest of your life. So you might be in a situation where you have had to contribute to something because of a particular situation in your life. You don't have a choice at that point, and it's really difficult to see the consequences of that, right? So, and it's also a lot of burden to put on the individual who is in that situation at that point to be able to think about that or to help you out, because you cannot, you know, that's you don't have that kind of power. So I think organizations, you know, like the ones that we've been talking about, that take on that advocacy, to take on and see, like, okay, you know, where is the limit? Like, what is it? Track and trace. Yeah. What are the, and people have been talking about this, you know, what are the consequences in terms of equality? Who is the most likely to be track and traced? Who is most likely to be reluctant to give up some contact information because it might have wider implications for visa data, for, you know, benefits and things like that? I think it's really, these are really important questions.
Oh, absolutely. And I talked about our program at Good Things Foundation around providing the tablets, and one person who was an asylum seeker said that there must be a catch. It can't be free. You must be wanting to get something from me. And they turned down the opportunity of having this because they didn't trust that it could be, you know, classic. There's no such thing as a free device. A couple of things on the Q&A. This one for you, Atif, is that Paolo asked around AI-based technologies that are trained based on data around people who are already connected, and how that deepens inequality. Some of these are more like a statement than a question, but basically saying that actually if you use AI to design new systems, the data that it is using is the data that the people who are online have provided, and therefore there's an inherent bias because it won't be representing the people who are not online. I don't know if you've got a comment on that one, Atif.
No, I do, and yeah, very much so. I mean, look, you know, right, this is played out in so many ways, right down to, you know, the famous hand dryer that only works if you've got white hands, you know, and it's to do with who designed the AI in the first place. But I don't know. I mean, I think we're dangerously, I suppose, and it's the world of tech. It does it often. We get excited about one story and we make sure it's really clean and seen, and the advancement of the technology excites us so much that we do lose the balance. And then the other way, and we're seeing it. In fact, globally, we're watching the whole world be very frightened of technology and making assumptions that just clearly aren't there. And it has a really powerful mental health consequence. So it's important to keep the balance right. I think that we're in a space where we've never been able to be more agile. Like, I can't say that with much more, you know, real positiveness. If I think about wheelchair users, for example, being able to access their courses with the same equality and equity that hasn't been afforded before, right down to learners who are able to see the Louvre Museum, you know, in Paris, and see everything because everything's been recorded through 3D, and that's not been available before COVID. It could always have been available before COVID, at least for the last 4 years, but it hasn't been. The situation has forced it. AI I'll give a really good example, which I think is fantastic, is an organization that we're working with DNA. It's called Neatbox, and it uses kind of a GPS or a geo-tracking system, and you can sort of see the strengths of that and perhaps the negatives, as Helen said about track and trace. What I really love about this is somebody could say they, use the examples of COVID, where so many people were forced into not being able to access shopping markets, and then the shops all got together, not on the online narrative, but certainly on the accessible hours for the elderly, the poor, the elderly, the most vulnerable. I sit on the board for Dispute Rights UK, and they were very involved in making this real. What it didn't present, and it's really important to understand this, and this is where AI plays a role, and good applications, is that young people, say, given a scenario, a young man, 22 years old, with fibromyalgia, who is flaring up, he has to really mentally cope with the idea that it's vulnerable to go out there, in the early part of this especially, and then have to deal with a supermarket bouncer that says, oh, you look too young to be allowed in this part of the hour, or you look too fit and healthy. All these things create, and you can multiply that story 1,000 times, over 1,000, because most disabilities that we're seeing are hidden. In the case of using Neatbox, what it does is it allows a person to attend a supermarket that's signed up to it, and they'll even say their name, providing they want to disclose. And this is about choice again, and whether you want to. But in essence, it will say, okay, this is Tom. Tom is arriving, and Tom has, muscular dystrophy. He has this, he has that. And Tom can share as much as he wants to. But the most important thing is, a person can look at it, and on their side of things, they see when Tom is arriving, and they can see what impact the condition is causing, and whether Tom might need physical assistance, even with a trolley. All of those things without having to really say much. It's a really good example. And it's an example that doesn't force people to use it, but it's a very good piece of example of how technology is strengthening participation. And without really, I mean, do you really want to be disabled and hidden and have to keep saying, hey, I'm not elderly, but I'm really going through this, to somebody who may not be that well trained in interpreting that? Yeah.
So one more question, and then I'm going to come to each of you for a soundbite. So the question is, that was asked earlier, as an individual, this is a very practical question, as an individual, what can I do to help the inclusion of others or to address systemic inequality? So what can someone who's a delegate here today, what can they do to help the inclusion of others? Ellen?
Shall I go? I think, take a good hard look around you and all the organizations and the companies and the situations that you're in. And is there anything that, you as an individual, as part of these broader networks and as a participant in society, are noticing? You can call people, organizations out on that this is actually it's not going to be working, or you can, take a look and say, like, actually, I've now just realized that that action that I took in that space might have a detrimental consequence. I think, that's the thing. Just look around you, open your eyes, have these discussions with people. If we don't talk about it, if we don't notice it, then nothing will change. And I think that's the first step. Just, creating awareness, not about all the good things that technology can do, because I think we know that as well, that's also important, but really creating awareness around the people around you that this is a thing that we're going to have to tackle and deal with, and that sometimes these types of inequalities or disadvantages are hidden. So
great. And Atif?
It's very much similar. It's an attitudinal shift, really. Be excited by it. Be excited. I mean, I mean that not in a trite way. Sometimes the technology that can speak to the most marginalized person in the room speaks to probably everybody in the room. And to recognize that is an asset. That is an asset. Be excited, not so much what it does for you, but what it does to enhance the experience of somebody you barely know. There's no such thing as assistive technology. I always say it's just a tool. Either it works or it doesn't. Getting rid of special technology for special people is probably a first stance that everyone can do. Let's just get rid of it. Just normalize tools that build equality.
And I think that's right. And I think that, Ellen, you said it really early in the panel, was about one thing that COVID-19 did is it made people who were online realize that these millions of people, billions of people globally, millions of people in the UK who are digitally excluded, were absolutely excluded from every single thing that many of us, like myself, took for granted every single day. As an individual, very, very pragmatically, I've just put in the chat panel and the web address for Learn My Way. It's just a simple online tool, and it reads to you, Atif. So if you can't read, it will read the words out for you. So that's just a very, very simple and pragmatic thing that you can do with your granny today, and just help them to use Learn My Way. So I'm going to come to each of you, Atif and Ellen, for your soundbite. So what is your soundbite to summarize the entire panel that we've been discussing today for how should we address digital equality for the future, or whatever else you want to say? Go to you first, Ellen.
Lucky me. Okay, so I think I'll start the comment with where we also started this discussion, is to say, okay, let's move away a little bit from seeing it as a technical problem and seeing it as a social problem, both in terms of that we need to start being aware of that, how what happens is in digital space can amplify some of the issues that exist in wider society. I think that's something that we can all agree on, that we've agreed on in this panel, that is really important. I think for me as well is to kind of understand that we have a collective responsibility, that it's not just about individuals getting technologies and skills who might not have them at the moment, but for all of us to be aware that how we behave online and the kinds of digital spaces that we design by our behavior contribute to the digital future and the people who come after us. And so that the time to do this is now and not to wait until something happens. So to be proactive, I like that word, proactive, to think about what kind of future we want, and then to shape our actions and our engagement with other people, organizations, businesses, individuals, governments, in such a way that we can create that future so that we're all part of it and that we can invite everybody into that.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And Atif, what's your soundbite to summarize the panel?
I think in 3 words, it'd be keep it human. And what I mean by that is that ultimately, and wonderfully, we've all really talked about it, these are human-centered, it needs human-centered solutions for human-centered needs. Yeah, we have to recognize that, and we're going to be challenged by that more and more. We've talked, really in a positive way as best we can over really sad and serious subjects around socioeconomic loss, about exclusion, poverty, and even trauma. but it is a human set. These are tools ultimately, and we've got to get to that point where these tools are either accessible to people or they're not, and to be really fundamental about that, without recognizing, you know, the biggest asset in the room isn't the technology, it's the lived experience. It's the one that says, look, I'll show you how this can be bent because my experience would bend it for you, or I'll show you why it can't, and then folks like me won't be able to use it. And that in itself will tell you a lot and probably save you money. So I guess really, in a colorful way, to keep it human, that's why we're doing it in the first place, right?
That's absolutely right. And as we've said, that COVID-19 absolutely exacerbated and exposed digital inequalities. And my hope is that it has exposed it in such a way that it's raised the consciousness that this is something that we absolutely should be tackling, something that we absolutely can tackle, and that we can make sure that we at least have the digital equalities, so that we can make sure that the social equalities can follow. So that's it from me. I just want to apologise to Ruth before I hand back to Olivier. So sorry, Ruth, for saying that grannies were not tech able. I'm old enough to be a granny myself, and I didn't mean that at all. We help lots of people who are not grannies, and then other people who are grannies. No apologies accepted. So apologies to all the older people offended by that remark. But thank you so much for all of your questions. They've been absolutely amazing. And from me, before I hand over to Olivier, I just want to say a huge thank you to Atif and to Helen. I think we had a really great conversation, and I hope all the delegates enjoyed it too.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you very much.